Welcome to Joshua's story. We've now got to presentation 5. And I've entitled this The Northern Campaign. Joshua's story, The Northern Campaign. Let's look back at the Southern Campaign, which came in the previous presentation. There's our map. The base camp at Gilgal and the area subdued there in the pale orange light colour. The army moved west. Then it moved south, and from a new base camp they subdued that area. They took the main fortresses in the area, with the exception of Jerusalem. So very roughly, that's the area that was conquered. The main fortresses were taken, the rulers were killed, and the land was subdued, brought under control. Then the army goes back to the base camp in Gilgal, near the River Jordan. Now let's move on from the southern campaign to the northern campaign. I've shaded in the area there in the pale buff colour. Yet again, the local rulers get together to combine their armies against Joshua and the Israelite army. Normally, these local rulers would be fighting each other, but they got together. And they got together under the leadership of the ruler of Hatsaw. Not sure if that's pronounced the right way, Hazor or Hatsaw. I'm going to call it Hatsaw, which was a large, fortified city, large for those days. And together they had a pretty strong army, and it was a well-equipped army. And they gathered together just southwest of Hatsaw. But Joshua launches a sudden attack, directed by God, and the army was completely defeated. They were well equipped, they had chariots. Now the Israelites did not have chariots, they were still in the Bronze Age. The army in the north had just entered the Iron Age. So they burned the chariots, and they hamstrung the horses so they couldn't be used again. They killed the leaders, and there was a long campaign over the whole of the northern area. The key places were captured, leaders were killed, the people were killed. The whole area was taken over. Let's look at Hatsaw just in a bit more detail. There's a picture of an aerial photograph in the modern era. And that's the bit that's been excavated. Because the city was indeed a city. It was big with a large number of inhabitants. Well fortified and strong. Far too strong and big for the small army of the Israelites to have taken on their own. It's about 15 kilometres north of the Lake of Galilee, and there's a lake nearby that it overlooks. It was big. And it was a major commercial and trade centre. It was on trade routes. It controlled a lot of trades. Indeed, it controlled the whole of the northern area. Hatsaw had huge influence and power. It had been battled over before. Descendants of the Hittites and Egyptian power, they had battled over it. It had some sort of Canaanite religion there, with all its evil practices. And part of the trade was trading of tin. We're coming to the end of the Bronze Age, moving into the Iron Age. The Israelites were not there yet. Some of the other nations round about were beginning to get into the Iron Age. But tin is essential for making bronze. Now, there's been a lot of archaeological evidence gathered over the site. and the destruction by the Israelites can be dated about the mid-13th century BC, which fits the kind of time and chronology of Joshua's campaign. And there are various documents coming from Egypt that showed that Hatsaw was in fact regarded as part of Egypt, but it was lost to the Hebrews. So a lot of the evidence here just fits what we know from the book of Joshua. And indeed there is a lot of evidence that supports what the book of Joshua actually said. The evidence shows from archaeology that the Israelites reoccupied it, but from time to time it fell into Canaanite hands. Eventually, this remarkable army commander, Tiglath-Pileser III of Assyria, with his large army, he sacked Hatsaw in 732 BC. He just flattened it, he left it devastated, and it's been abandoned ever since. So that's a bit about this city of Hatsaw. Very important to capture it and to have control of it, because it controlled the northern areas. Just before Joshua set out to capture it, God came to him and said, "Do not be afraid of them, because by this time tomorrow I will hand all of them, slain, over to Israel." Joshua was leading a smaller army, less well equipped. The odds were stacked against him, humanly speaking. But God gave him that reassurance. And it happened. And a kind of summary towards the end of the chapter. Interesting first paragraph. Except for the Hivites living in Gibeon, not one city made a treaty of peace with the Israelites. And the Israelites took them all in battle. Remember the story of the Gibeonites? They took Joshua and the Israelites in by deception, got a peace agreement with them, which Joshua and the Israelites had to stick by afterwards, because the Gibeonites realized they couldn't win. But no one else did it. They could have, but they chose not to. Look at the second paragraph. For it was the Lord himself who hardened their hearts to wage war against Israel, so that he might destroy them totally, exterminating them without mercy, as the Lord had commanded Moses. Now that's a pretty devastating sentence. Let's look at the word hardened, or hardened their hearts. It's difficult to translate this and capture the meaning of that. It does not mean that God just made them resist. What it does mean is this. When people choose to resist God's ways, eventually God just says, "Okay, I'll let you do it your own way." Now that's what hardening their hearts means. He kind of confirms them in what they'd already decided they were going to do. They weren't going to go for any treaties of peace. They weren't going to find out more about what God was all about. They weren't interested. All they're interested in is just wiping out Israel. And God left them to it. So hardening their hearts really means that. And the consequences of their resistance, their unwillingness to compromise, to give way, to listen, to seek a treaty of peace, was that they were destroyed and exterminated, but exterminated without mercy, as the Lord had commanded Moses. I find that hard. What is the ethics of God deciding that it's going to exterminate people? Yes, they deserve to be exterminated. In a sense, we all do. But how can we justify that? I'll raise the question here. I'm going to pick it up in the final presentation because it deserves a long discussion and analysis. What are the ethics of God as a warrior? But that's the summary and conclusion of the campaign in the north. The first quotation makes it very clear. It's God's battle, and when it's God's battle, it's God's victory. I am going to hand them over. says God to Joshua. There's a lesson there for us all. But secondly, where there is persistent rebellion, God leaves us to the consequences. And the consequences tend to follow as night follows day. Continue to resist God? Well, there are consequences. And we're talking about this life. There's lessons there for all of us as well. Now there were further campaigns. Back to our map. The southern area, taken over. The northern area, taken over. Bits of the middle have been conquered, bits are still to be taken. At that time Joshua went and destroyed the Anakites from the hill country, from Hebron, Debir and Anab, that's in the south. From all the hill country of Judah, that's coming up near Jerusalem. And from all the hill country of Israel, that's moving north into the green bit in the middle and into the lower part of the buff area. Joshua totally destroyed them in their towns. No Anakites were left in Israelite territory. Only in Gaza, Gath and Ashdod did any survive. That's on the coastland to the left of the southern area. Who are the Anakites? Sometimes mistakenly translated as giants. But they certainly were very tall and they were very strong. And there are Egyptian records that speak of a people group living in the area who were exceptionally strong and exceptionally tall. And that probably is this group. Joshua took them on. They were destroyed. But they weren't destroyed in the south. Gaza, Gath and Ashdod, that's the western coast of the Mediterranean, just in the south. And that people group were left there. They were unable to destroy them, and they caused problems in the future. And we remember Goliath in the story of David. Gaza, the town today which gives us the name Gaza City, and the Gaza Strip, that strip of land in the southwest of Israel area, still causing problems today. So they had the land. That's the rough area again of the land that had been conquered. But why did God give the land to the Israelites? The reminder is it's God's land. And he gave it to the people of God, the people who were seeking to follow God, the Lord of the universe, as a kind of secure base from which they could reach out to the nations all around and show the nations round about the way of God, the best way to live. But why did they have to kill and drive out the previous inhabitants? That's a really difficult and deep question. Yes, the inhabitants that were there were living particularly evil culture, and they had some dreadful practices, with all sorts of fertility rituals along with child sacrifice. But why had they to be driven out or killed? And as I said before, we'll look at that major question in a lot more detail later. Do they have the land forever? No. The Bible makes it absolutely clear. The land is God's land. God's people had it as their base. Condition was obedience. And when they fail in obedience, they lose the land. And they lost it at various stages in their history, till eventually they lost it completely under the Romans in AD 70. The summary: so Joshua took the entire land, just as the Lord had directed Moses, and he gave it as an inheritance to Israel. God's land given to them, according to their tribal divisions. Then the land had rest from war. The word rest we have to watch. It means a task completed. The land had been taken. All the key fortress centres had been captured. One or two exceptions like Jerusalem. But the key points had been taken. The key leadership had been killed. The people had to enter and take the land and make it their own. But the task of capture had been completed. So they'd rest from war. That's the picture that's in the book of Joshua. The problem was there were still pockets of resistance. I marked 3 of them, but they aren't the only 3. Up in the north, the remnants of the Hittite Empire, with their strong armed forces and their greater, better technologies, continually encroached in the north. And for most of the history of the people of Israel, they didn't control that area completely. In the centre, in the circle, the little fortress town of Jerusalem, difficult to capture, not taken finally until the days of David. And then in the coastland, the area that we know as the Philistine area, the Gaza Strip. Joshua, in the book of Joshua, there are detailed lists of the defeated rulers. There's an amazing amount of precise detail of rulers, locations, places, the towns that were captured, the precise allocations to the tribes, listed by towns and cities and areas and dividing lines. Enormous amount of detail, which gives us a very good picture of what was going on. But let's look at this Philistine group. The group that were there that caused endless problems. They'd come originally from Asia Minor, perhaps from Crete, and they'd been there a long time, since the 17th century BC. They had several major settlements. They were finally wiped out by Nebuchadnezzar, who deported the remnants of them in 604 BC. They were polytheistic in religion, with gods like Baal, Ashtarte, and Dagon. They were great traders, seafarers as well, and a lot of alcohol production. There's a lot of archaeology, and the archaeology is consistent with the kind of struggles that the Bible pictures between Philistia and Israel. And the archaeological evidence is consistent with that. Indeed, there's an enormous amount of archaeological evidence that gives sometimes detailed and sometimes much broader support for the biblical account of what was going on. Still gaps in our knowledge, still things that we don't understand. But the broad brush picture is there. Now the tribes were given their allocations. Let's look at this in a broad sense. I'm putting in the references from the book of Joshua. Much earlier, the land to the east of the Jordan had been allocated to Reuben, Gad, and half of the tribe of Manasseh. There was no land allocated to the tribe of Levi. Chapter 14 lays down the general principles of how the land would be divided on the west, partly due to size and strength of the various tribal groups. Given to tribes, but there was a specific allocation given to Caleb, along with Joshua, the only person who'd been there in the time of Moses, when the people had refused to enter the land all these years before. Now an old man, he was given a specific allocation. Allocations were then given to Judah, Ephraim, and the other half of Manasseh. Now the remaining allocations, many of which were in the north and were more difficult, they had to plan these out, and it required some land surveys, described in chapter 18. And the allocations for the other 7 tribal groups there then were made. Finally, the people give Joshua a personal allocation, just like Caleb. There are certain cities that were picked out and called cities of refuge. We'll come to that in a minute. There are cities that were labelled as Levitical cities. and we'll also return to that. Then the whole thing is brought together in conclusions at the end of chapter 21. Now let's look at that on the ground. There's the map. These are the approximate tribal divisions. You can see that the land area are quite different. Some are very small areas and some are spread out. Part of that reflects the sizes of the tribes, which varied, but part of it also reflects the nature of the land, some being more fertile and able to support a population better. But that's the tribal areas that were set out and allocated by Joshua and Eleazar, his priest. Look at the bottom right of the map. Israel was hemmed in by attacking nations. And it's been Israel's history throughout its time that there are nations round about continually putting pressure on it. We see this in the days of David and Solomon, the kings that follow, right up to the end of the nation of Israel and the end of the nation of Judah. Let's look at some of them. That's the land, very roughly, that they'd taken. But up in the north, the remnants of the great Hittite Empire, continually trying to encroach in the north. And the tribes in the north often couldn't hold their ground. Look at the bottom of the map, the Edomites, descendants of Esau, the twin brother of Jacob. Continuous and jealousy, trying to encroach in on the area of Judah. Coming in from the east, the Ammonites. Coming in from the desert, looking at the more fertile land, continually encroaching. The Moabites, coming in the southern part of the Dead Sea, sometimes teaming up with the Edomites. And the group that we've talked about before, the Philistine group, that caused endless problems to the people of Israel during the time of Saul and David particularly. The land allocations, they're shown. They were allocated to clans and families, not to individuals. We are far too individualistic in the West. And this is more typical of what happens in the world. Families and clans, groupings, were regarded more highly. There were exceptions though. Joshua and Caleb, the only two from the days of Moses. They were given specific allocations, small but specific to them and their own families. By this time, both were old men. There were 12 tribes, but you'll notice there is nothing to the tribe of Joseph because it's been split into two. Joseph got double, Manasseh and Ephraim, and it's a very big land area, partly because these tribes grew numerically. So the 12 original sons of Jacob, Levi, his descendants got nothing, but Joseph got twice. So there's still 12 tribal allocations. The Levites, from them were drawn the priests, and they were given no land. But with all these people coming in, the nations round about, hemming them in, some of the tribes struggled. The northern tribes struggled to hold out the Hittites. Dan, you can see Dan in the dark green, continually struggling against the Philistine group. The eastern tribes continually being encroached upon by the people coming in from the desert. And fun enough, Benjamin right in the middle there, the pale blue. Quite a number of the towns there contained original Canaanite populations. That's where the Gibeon town group was. And there was a kind of compromise went on there, and Benjamin never really flourished. If we look at the history going over the centuries, God had given them the land, and all the great fortresses and leaders had been destroyed. But the people had to take possession of the land, trusting God to give them the victory. And often they failed to do that. And they left local people there who caused endless problems in subsequent generations. Because that's what happened, compromise. The Canaanite culture started to infiltrate into the Jewish culture. And the Canaanite culture had so much of fertility cults, false worship, and even the sacrifice of children. Not a good culture. And as the compromise took place, the purity of the Israelite way of life was being lost, compromised. And the tribes struggled to retain control. Now we can see the land against a much bigger map. We're looking at the eastern end of the Mediterranean Sea, the Red Sea coming up, just the tip of the Arabian Gulf at the right of your picture there, where Kuwait is today. But much of the land was barren desert. Yes, there were occasional oases, little populations had survived. But that's the bit that's got some sort of fertility, known as the Fertile Crescent, either because there's rainfall or because the rivers there can provide good irrigation. So that's the bit that people wanted to be in. Running from Egypt right up through Israel, you can see the land that they conquered there, right up through what's now Syria and into Iraq, right down to Kuwait and the Arabian Gulf. It's a kind of channel of trade routes and communications between Africa, Europe and Asia. And you can live there because the land is fertile, there's enough water to survive. That's the importance of the land. It's all God's land, but God gave a people group descended from Abraham this land because Abraham had decided to follow God and go his way. And God was seeking to reach the world through this people group called the people of Israel. And he gave them the strategic land as their secure base from which they could outreach to the people groups all around. Tragically, history shows that they largely failed in this. Although one of the Israelites, Jesus himself, came from that people group and had an impact and has an impact today throughout the entire world. But continually they were being attacked. Originally the land was owned by Egypt. The Canaanites were ruled by Egypt. And Egypt kept trying to infiltrate from the south. The remnants of the Hittite Empire from the north. Then there was the great Assyrian Empire attacking in. And later still, the Babylonian Empire conquered the Assyrian Empire, came in and indeed flattened the lot. And there were skirmishes between the Babylonian and the Egyptian empires. And the land of Israel was caught in the middle. So you can see the importance of the land and why God gave them this land, the significance and the purpose in God's long-term planning for this. But they were against major problems, and they had to learn to live by faith. Caleb was given land, been promised by Moses in Numbers chapter 14. Caleb had a different spirit. He followed God wholeheartedly. God promised to bring him into the land, and his descendants would inherit it. Caleb remembers that and asks for the land, and he asks for a specific piece of land in the south. Joshua gave the land around Hebron. Hebron, the town, is still there today, and he gave it to Caleb and his family. Caleb was a descendant of Jephunneh the Kenizzite. The Kenizzite, not a descendant of the Jewish people. He's a descendant of somebody who came in And there were many people who did come in, who recognized that the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob was the Almighty God who made the universe. And they came and joined the people of God and became one of them. And Caleb came from that root. That was the land given to Caleb in the south. What about Joshua? At the very end, the Israelites gave Joshua an inheritance. They offered him Timnath-Serah. There's Jerusalem, Shiloh, which became a kind of spiritual centre, Shechem, the place where they continually were meeting, and you can see Timnath-Serah in relation to these towns. In the hill country, the hills running through the spine of the country, in the hill country there. And Joshua built up the town and settled there. That's what the people were meant to do, to build things up and to settle, to take them over, to take possession. Joshua and Caleb were both old men by this stage. But they moved on, took possession, won the battles, and had peace in their own place. Summarised by Joshua, these are the territories that Eleazar the priest, Joshua son of Nun, and the heads of the tribal clans of Israel assigned by lot at Shiloh, in the presence of the Lord at the entrance to the tent of meeting. And so they finished dividing the land. Exactly what assigned by lot means we do not know. But somehow they would pray to God and ask for God's direction, and some sort of device was used to help them get God's direction. And the land was allocated in the light of that. So that's how Joshua came out of it. Cities of refuge, we touched upon them before. In those days, if somebody had caused another person to be killed, usually by accident, and these did happen in those days quite a lot, then the family of the victim would have a blood feud with the family who committed the event that had caused the death. I would wipe off the other family. Blood feuds. To stop this happening, they set up cities of refuge. So there was unintentional, accidental death. The person who caused it could flee to a city of refuge. When they got there, they were protected from the blood revenge of the other family. They stand a kind of trial there to make sure that it was accidental or unintentional, and they could stay there protected. By the death of the high priest of the time, they could return to their home safely. And it was to stop this terrible bloodletting and revenge, which was the custom of the people of those days. Now there are 6 of these cities of refuge listed. And if you look at the map and see where they were placed, you can see how they were scattered throughout the land. So nobody lived too far away from a city of refuge. So if somebody had caused the death of another person, accidentally or unintentionally, they could flee to these places where they were going to be protected once the appropriate checks had been made, so that revenge wasn't taken upon them and their families, which would have been the custom of the day. Very sensible, very practical. But society was very different then compared to today. The Levites, they got no land. It was the tribe from which the priests were drawn, and they got no territory allocated to them. But there's a list of 48 specific towns scattered throughout the land where they could stay. They're given a bit of land for grazing animals, but they didn't have to indulge in agriculture and provide for themselves, because they depended in a large measure on the gifts from the people. You could summarize it this way. They lived among the people, they served the people, and the people served them by providing them with food. They were scattered throughout the nation, and they lived among the people where the people lived, so that they could help and teach the people about God and conduct the various religious ceremonies that were required, being provided for by the people. There's an interesting model there. It's very practical, very straightforward. Something from which we could learn things today. Back to Shechem. The eastern tribes, that's those that were in the green area, the men had come across so that they could join in the warfare till the whole land was taken. Now they're ready to go back home because the land had been taken. So they were going back across the River Jordan back to the green area, which was their territory. But when they got to the Jordan bank, just before they crossed, they built a large altar. And the western tribes didn't understand this. They saw this as an attempt to set up a rival religion, and they realized that would cause problems. So they sent a delegation. What are you doing? What's this all about? And the eastern tribes explain why they did what they did. They wanted to build a large kind of monument altar on the banks of the Jordan as a reminder that they belonged to God's people. They could look back across the Jordan and see it. We're part of the same group. We all belong together. That was their intention, but it was misunderstood. Remember, in those days, people couldn't read or write. They had to rely on physical objects to remind them of events and things of importance. And happily, unity between the West and the East was re-established. We have to remember it was God's land, and against the overwhelming odds against them, the land was taken. Only God could give it. They were not strong enough to do it on their own. They neither had the technology or the numbers. But the land was taken. But the people had then to go in and possess it. They had to make it their own, taking over the cities, driving out the local people, setting up agriculture and trade and everything else. They had to possess it. And the land was God's land. And if they were disobedient, they would lose the land. Because God gave it to them so that through the people of Israel, God could reach the world of humanity. But if the people of Israel were disobedient, that long-term purpose would be lost. Therefore, the land would be lost. The logic follows as night follows day. And sadly, it happened. Let's bring it all together. And I'm summarizing with the actual words from the book of Joshua. So the Lord gave Israel all the land he had sworn to give their ancestors, and they took possession of it and settled there. The Lord gave them rest on every side, just as he had sworn to their ancestors. Not one of their enemies withstood them. The Lord gave all their enemies into their hands. Not one of all the Lord's good promises to Israel failed. Every one was fulfilled. God kept his word. He kept his promise. He carried it out. And Joshua chapter 21 verse 45 is stressing that. The sad story is that so often the people of Israel failed to carry out their part of the bargain, to go in and possess the land and make God's land their land, and then use that as the base to reach wider humanity. But we'll look at that a bit further in the next part. Because in presentation 6, we'll look at the final stages of Joshua's story.